8 years. That is exactly how long my mother pretended I was in a grave. 8 Christmases, 8 birthdays, and nearly 3,000 days of absolute silence. But the moment my face hit the newsstand on the cover of a global business magazine, my phone lit up like a Christmas tree. "Come home," the text read. "We need to talk." She thought she was summoning her prodigal daughter, a lost sheep, desperate for forgiveness. She had no idea she was inviting the wolf who had just bought the bank holding her mortgage. Before I tell you how I walked into that house and turned their world upside down, let me know in the comments if you have ever been the black sheep who became the success story your family could not handle. Hit like and subscribe if you believe revenge is a dish best served with a side of absolute power. My name is Nia, and at 32, I am the CEO of Ethelgard Systems, a cybersecurity firm valued in the billions. But right now, sitting in the back of a custom Phantom Rolls-Royce with tinted windows, I felt like that terrified 24-year-old girl again. The leather seat beneath me cost more than my parents made in a decade, yet my stomach was in knots. I looked down at the passenger seat next to me. There it was, the latest issue of Forbes, my face staring back, bold, unrepentant, and powerful. Then I looked out the window at the cracked pavement of the neighborhood I swore I would never revisit. The contrast was suffocating. Inside this car, the air was filtered and smelled of expensive leather. Outside, the world looked gray, worn down by years of stagnation. My phone buzzed again, vibrating against the sleek fabric of my trousers. Another text from Verna. "Not Mom. Verna. Family Christmas party at 6:30. Do not be late. We have something important to discuss." The audacity almost made me laugh out loud. The last time I saw Verna, it was Christmas Eve 8 years ago. I could still feel the phantom bite of the cold wind on my skin. It was 5 degrees outside that night. She had thrown my suitcase onto the snow-covered lawn because I refused to marry a 60-year-old deacon she was trying to impress for social standing. "Get out!" she had screamed, her face twisted in a way that haunted my nightmares for years. "You are dead to us. Do not come back until you learn your place." I spent that night shivering at a Greyhound bus station, crying until my tear ducts ran dry. I had $10 in my pocket and a heart shattered by the people who were supposed to protect me. Now suddenly I was resurrected. Why? Because they missed me. No, because they needed something. They always needed something. I tapped the intercom button, my finger steady despite the racing of my heart. "James Park around the corner 2 blocks down. I do not want them to see the car." James nodded, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror, with a look of concern he tried to hide. "Are you sure about this, Ms. Johnson?" I adjusted my coat. It was a cashmere trench, simple, elegant, and devoid of any flashy logos. To the untrained eye, it looked plain. To those who knew, it was a $12,000 garment. But my family did not know quality. They only knew brands. To them, I would look like a woman who shopped at thrift stores. That was the point. I needed them to show me who they really were before I showed them who I had become. "I am sure, James," I said, my voice lower than usual. "They need to see Nia. The failure before they meet Nia, the CEO." Stepping out into the biting wind, the smell of wood smoke and old regrets hit me instantly. I walked the 2 blocks to the house, my boots crunching on the gravel. The house looked exactly the same, frozen in time like a bad memory. The white paint was peeling in long, ugly strips, and the porch sagged slightly to the left. It was a shrine to mediocrity. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from fear, but from a cold, simmering rage that I had been refining into fuel for the last 8 years. I was not here for reconciliation. I was here for closure. And maybe, just maybe, a little bit of justice. I reached the front door and hesitated for a fraction of a second. I touched the cold wood, remembering how many times I had scrubbed this porch on my hands and knees while my sister Bianca watched TV. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and knocked. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet street. A moment later, the door swung open, Verna stood there. She looked older, her face lined with a bitterness that no amount of drugstore makeup could hide. She wore a festive sweater that looked itchy and cheap. She did not smile. She did not open her arms. She did not cry. She just looked me up and down, her eyes analyzing every inch of my appearance, looking for flaws. Her gaze lingered on my plain black boots, dismissing them instantly. "You made it," she said, her voice dry as dust. "Wipe your feet. That is a new rug. Do not track mud on it." "No hello. No, I missed you. Just in order to wipe my feet." I stepped inside the heat of the house, stifling and smelling of overly sweet cinnamon candles. Before I could even take off my coat, a high-pitched voice rang out from the living room. "Is that the prodigal sister?" Bianca appeared in the hallway. My younger sister, the golden child. She was wearing a bright red dress that was too tight and looked expensive from a distance but cheap up close, dripping in flashy costume jewelry that jingled when she moved. She held a glass of wine, looking me over with a smirk that I remembered all too well. It was the same smirk she wore when she watched me get kicked out 8 years ago. "Wow, Nia," she drawled, taking a sip of her wine. "You look tired. Life has been rough on you, huh? I see you are still wearing that drab style. I have some old dresses from last season if you need charity." I felt a flash of heat rise in my chest, but I forced it down. I kept my face blank, my expression unreadable. "It has been a long time, Bianca," I said softly. Bianca laughed, a harsh sound. "Yeah, well, try not to depress everyone. Greg is inviting some important people over later. Try to stay in the background." The moment the door clicked shut behind me, the air in the hallway felt heavy, thick with the scent of cinnamon and judgment. Verna did not offer to take my coat. Instead, she stood with her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes narrowing as she scanned my outfit like a customs officer looking for contraband. I was wearing a charcoal trench coat made of pure vicuna wool, one of the rarest fabrics on earth, worth more than the Honda Civic parked in her driveway. Underneath, I wore a simple black silk blouse and tailored trousers that had been cut precisely for my frame in Milan. But to Verna, whose understanding of wealth was limited to logos printed in neon letters across chests, I looked destitute. "You know," she said, letting out a sharp sigh that sounded like a deflating tire, "I told Bianca we should have sent you some money for a proper outfit. You look like you just walked out of a funeral home in a bad neighborhood. That coat is so plain. Did you get it at the Salvation Army?" I fought the urge to check the tag that read Loro Piana. Instead, I simply clasped my hands in front of me and lowered my head slightly. "It keeps me warm, Verna," I replied, my voice quiet. "Warm does not get you respect," she snapped, turning her back to walk toward the kitchen. "Appearance is everything, Nia. I taught you that. Look at your sister. Now that is how a successful woman dresses." As if on cue, Bianca strutted from the living room, her heels clicking loudly on the floor. She had added a fur stole to her red dress, despite the heating in the house being cranked up to 75 degrees. It looked synthetic and shed tiny fibers as she moved. On her wrists, she wore a stack of gold bangles that clinked aggressively. I noticed the faint greenish tint on her skin beneath the metal. Fake gold. Fake luxury. Just like everything else in this house. "Oh my God." Nia, Bianca squealed, though her eyes remained cold and calculating. "You look so practical. I guess when you are working barely above minimum wage, fashion is not really a priority, right?" She reached out and fingered the lapel of my coat, rubbing the fabric between her thumb and forefinger with a sneer. "Wool blend," she guessed, pulling her hand away as if she had touched something sticky. "You know, Greg bought me a coat last week with actual fox fur trim. Maybe later, if you behave, I will let you try it on. It might help you remember what it feels like to have nice things." I forced a tight smile. "That is very generous of you, Bianca." It was exhausting, this dance. They needed me to be small so they could feel big. They needed my failure to validate their mediocre success. I watched Bianca preen, adjusting her hair extensions, which were a shade too light for her complexion. She looked at me with pity, but beneath the pity was fear. The fear that maybe, Just maybe, I was not as broken as I looked. But she pushed it down with insults. Suddenly, heavy footsteps approached from the dining room. Greg emerged, wiping his hands on a napkin. He was wearing a suit that was a size too tight around the shoulders, the fabric straining against his frame. He looked at me, then immediately looked down at my feet. My Italian leather boots were spotless, but to him, they were a threat. "Whoa! Hold on," he boomed, holding up a hand like a traffic cop. "You are not walking on my floors with those." He pointed a thick finger at the hardwood stretching out behind him. "I just had that white oak installed last month," Greg announced, puffing out his chest. "Imported. $50,000 for the first floor alone. I am not having your street grit scratching up my investment." He walked over to a small closet under the stairs and rummaged around for a moment before pulling out a pair of gray foam slippers. They were old. One of them had a tear near the toe and the foam was compressed and stained from years of use. They looked like something you would find in a lost and found bin at a public pool. "Here," he said, dropping them on the floor in front of me. "Put these on." I stared at the slippers. The disrespect was so calculated, so precise. He did not offer guest slippers. He did not offer socks. He offered me trash. He wanted to strip away even the dignity of my own footwear. I looked at Greg. His eyes were daring me to argue. He wanted a scene. He wanted me to complain so he could call me ungrateful, so he could tell Verna that I was causing trouble again. If I refused, I would be the angry, bitter sister. If I accepted, I was the submissive, defeated charity case. For a split second, I imagined buying the company that manufactured his flooring just to fire the person who sold it to him. But not yet. The game was just beginning. "I see," I said softly. "It is a beautiful floor, Greg. I would hate to ruin it." Slowly, deliberately, I bent down. I unzipped my boots, feeling their gazes burning into my back. I placed my boots neatly by the door, lining them up perfectly. Then I slid my feet into the dirty, torn foam slippers. They felt cold and flimsy. I stood up, feeling the humiliating squish of the old foam. I looked ridiculous, a woman in a $12,000 coat wearing garbage on her feet. "There," Greg said, satisfied. "Now you look like you fit in. Come on. Lunch is almost ready, and try not to touch the walls. We just had them painted." I followed them into the dining room, the sound of my shuffling slippers a stark contrast to their confident strides. I kept my head down, hiding the fire in my eyes. They thought they had put me in my place. They thought the slippers made me small. They did not realize that by forcing me to bow, they had only given me a better view of their weak foundations, and I was ready to pull the whole house down. The dining room was a shrine to my mother Verna's desperation to appear wealthy. The crystal chandelier, which I knew she bought on clearance, cast a harsh, glittering light over the table set with porcelain plates and polished silver. There were 4 high-backed velvet-upholstered chairs arranged around the mahogany table. Verna took her seat at the head. Greg sat to her right, puffing out his chest like a king holding court. Bianca sat opposite him, adjusting her napkin with a flourish that made her bracelets jingle annoyingly. That left one spot, the spot where a chair should have been. "Oh," Verna said, looking up as if she had just noticed the vacancy. "We only bought 4 dining chairs. They were imported from Italy and quite expensive, so we did not want to buy extras we would not use." "Greg, be a dear and grab the spare seat from the garage for Nia." I stood in my foam slippers, watching as Greg smirked and disappeared for a moment. He returned, dragging a white plastic lawn chair. It was stained with grass marks on the legs and had a spiderweb crack running down the back. He placed it at the foot of the table, the plastic legs scraping loudly against his precious $50,000 floor. "There you go," Greg said, dusting off his hands. "It is sturdy, should hold you just fine." I stared at the lawn chair. It sat lower than the other chairs, meaning I would be looking up at them like a child at the grown-ups table. It was a calculated humiliation designed to make me feel small physically, so I would feel small emotionally. Without a word, I sat down. The plastic groaned under my weight and the table edge came up almost to my chest. "Dinner is served," Verna announced, uncovering a large platter of roast beef. The smell of rosemary and garlic filled the room, and for a second my stomach betrayed me with a growl. I had not eaten since breakfast in Paris yesterday. Verna picked up the carving knife and fork. She sliced a thick, juicy slab of meat, the center perfectly pink and tender. "Greg, you need your strength for all that brain work at the bank," she cooed, sliding the prime cut onto his plate. "And Bianca, my beautiful girl, you need protein for your figure." She served Bianca a delicate lean slice. Then she served herself. Finally, she looked at the platter. All that remained was the end piece, tough gray, and mostly gristle, surrounded by a few burnt potatoes. She shoveled it onto a plate and passed it down to me. "You do not mind the end piece, do you, Nia?" she said, not asking a question but stating a fact. "You are probably used to simpler food. Rich meats might upset your stomach after whatever you have been eating these past 8 years. Besides, we do not want to waste it." I looked at the gray meat on my plate. I thought about the private chef who prepared my meals at my penthouse, the Wagyu beef I had fed to my dog last week because he looked at me with sad eyes. I picked up my fork and knife. "Thank you, Verna," I said, my voice steady. "It looks adequate." As we ate, the sound of silverware clicking against china filled the silence. Bianca kept glancing at me, chewing with her mouth slightly open, waiting for me to complain. When I didn't, she looked disappointed. That was when Greg decided to bless us with his intellect. He took a long sip of wine, swirled it around his glass, like he had seen people do in movies, and leaned back. "So Nia," he began, his voice taking on that lecture tone men like him reserve for women they deem inferior. "I bet you are wondering how we afford all this. The renovations, the lifestyle." I slowly cut a piece of the tough meat. I assumed debt, I thought. But I said nothing. "It is all about understanding the market," Greg continued, gesturing with his fork. "I have been moving the family portfolio into high-yield tech sectors. You probably do not follow the news living. However you live. But the world is changing. It is all about artificial intelligence now, crypto, and AI. I paused with my fork halfway to my mouth. I kept my face perfectly blank. "AI, I repeated flatly. "Yes, artificial intelligence," Greg said, speaking slowly as if I were a toddler. "It is complicated stuff. Algorithms, machine learning, basically computers thinking for themselves. I have been tracking a company called Ethelgard Systems. They are revolutionizing the sector. I told Mr. Sterling we need to go all in on them." I almost choked on my water. Ethelgard Systems, my company. The company I built from the ground up. The code he was talking about was written by my hands in a basement apartment 8 years ago. Now this man who probably could not reset his own Wi-Fi router without calling support was explaining my life's work to me. "Really," I said, allowing a tiny, dangerous smile to touch my lips. "And what makes this Ethelgard company so special?" Greg scoffed, shaking his head at Bianca. "See, she does not get it. It is too technical for you, Nia. Just know that they are the big dogs. And since I have an inside track on the market, I am positioning us to ride their wave. It is called financial literacy. Maybe after dinner, I can draw you a diagram so you understand how money actually works." Verna beamed at him. "You are so smart, Greg. We are so lucky to have a man with a head for business in the family, unlike some people who waste their potential." She shot a glare at me. "Nia was always good at math in school," Verna added dismissively. "But she never had the vision. That is why she is where she is, and you are where you are, Greg." I looked around the table, at Verna, who was practically drooling over Greg's imaginary success, at Bianca, who was checking her reflection in her spoon, and at Greg, the man who was bragging about investing in a company whose CEO was currently sitting on his plastic lawn chair eating his burnt leftovers. The silence that followed was heavy. I chewed the gristle slowly, the sound loud in my own ears. I watched Greg wipe gravy from his chin. He had no idea that the inside track he thought he had was about to lead him off a cliff. He was lecturing the architect about the building while standing on a trap door. "That is fascinating, Greg," I said, placing my knife and fork down neatly. "I would love to hear more about your insights on Ethelgard, especially their leadership. I hear the CEO is quite elusive." Greg laughed, a wet, arrogant sound. "The CEO, probably some tech bro in Silicon Valley. Doesn't matter who he is. What matters is that I am making money off him." I picked up my glass of water and took a sip, hiding the predatory glint in my eyes. I whispered to myself. If only you knew, Greg. If only you knew. Verna dabbed the corners of her mouth with her linen napkin, a signal that the performance of a pleasant family dinner was officially over. The air in the room shifted instantly, becoming colder and more transactional. Without a word, she reached under the table and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She placed it on the table next to the roast beef platter, sliding it across the polished wood until it stopped just inches from my plastic tray. "Now that we have eaten," Verna said, her voice dropping to a tone of serious maternal concern that made my skin crawl, "we need to discuss the real reason we asked you here. It is about your grandmother's property in Georgia." I sat up a little straighter in my flimsy chair, keeping my expression neutral. Grandma's land. 50 acres of red clay and pine trees near the state border. Verna had hated that place. She called it a mosquito-infested dump every time Grandma tried to get us to visit. "We have been reviewing the estate," Verna continued, folding her hands on the table. "And frankly, Nia, that land is a burden. It is just sitting there, overgrown with weeds, costing us money in property taxes every year. It is a drain on the family finances, and since you have been away, you probably did not realize how much strain it has put on us." She paused for effect, waiting for me to apologize. When I didn't, she cleared her throat and pressed on. "Luckily, Greg has been working very hard. He used his connections at the bank to find a buyer. It was not easy. Nobody wants dirt in the middle of nowhere. But because Greg is so talented, he managed to secure a deal." Greg leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine glass, looking smug. "I pulled some strings," he said, winking at Bianca. "Found a developer looking for a place to dump industrial waste. It is the only thing that land is good for. They offered $50,000 for the whole lot. $50,000. I kept my face still, but my mind was racing. I knew for a fact that the land sat directly on top of a massive lithium deposit, and it was also adjacent to a proposed site for a new hyperscale data center. A data center that my company Ethelgard Systems was currently bidding on. The land wasn't worth $50,000. It was worth $50 million. "We are going to sell it," Verna said firmly. "And because we are family, and because we know you are struggling, Nia, we decided to be generous. We are going to split the proceeds. We will use the majority to pay off the debts you left behind and do some necessary repairs on this house. But we want to give you $5,000. She said the number slowly, as if it were a life-changing fortune. $5,000. "It is a lot of money," Bianca chimed in, looking at her fingernails. "You could probably pay rent for a few months. Or buy a car that actually runs. You should be thanking Greg. He is basically saving your life." Verna tapped the envelope. "The paperwork is all here. It is a standard quitclaim deed. You just need to sign your rights over to Greg and he will handle the closing. We will cut you a check today. You can take the bus back to wherever you live with money in your pocket." I reached out and opened the envelope. The paper felt heavy in my hands. I scanned the document. It was exactly what I expected. A quitclaim deed transferring full ownership to a shell company called G&B Holdings LLC. I noted the initials, Greg and Bianca. They weren't selling it to a developer. They were transferring it to themselves to flip it later, cutting me out completely. I looked up at Greg, widening my eyes in feigned confusion. "I do not understand," I said, my voice soft and trembling slightly. $5,000. "Is that really all it is worth? Grandma always said the land was special. Maybe we should get a second appraisal, just to be sure." The atmosphere in the room shattered. Greg slammed his palm down on the table so hard the silverware rattled. My plastic chair shook from the vibration. "Are you serious?" Greg shouted, his face turning a blotchy red. "We offer you a lifeline, and you question me. I am a vice president at a bank, Nia. I do this for a living. You flip burgers or scrub toilets or whatever it is you do. What do you know about real estate valuation?" He stood up, towering over me, using his height to intimidate. "You are so ungrateful," he spat. "This is why you failed, Nia. You are stupid. You do not know when to take a win. That land is dirt, literal dirt, and you are questioning my expertise. You should be on your knees thanking me for getting you $5,000. Do you have any idea how hard I worked to find a buyer for that garbage heap?" Verna jumped in, her voice shrill. "Nia, sign the paper. Do not be difficult. Greg is trying to help you. Do not let your pride ruin the only good thing that has happened to you in 8 years. You are acting just like your father, stubborn and foolish." I looked down at the paper again, hiding the cold fury in my eyes. They called me stupid. They called me a failure. They thought $5,000 was enough to buy my birthright because they could not imagine a world where I was anything other than desperate. "I am sorry, Greg," I stammered, playing the part of the terrified victim perfectly. I wanted to be sure. It seems like such a big decision." "It is not a big decision," Greg roared, pointing a finger in my face. "It is a no-brainer. You sign, you get paid. You do not sign, you walk out of here with nothing. Zero. And do not expect us to let you sleep in the shed again. You sign it now, or you get out." I held the pen, my hand hovering over the signature line. "Okay," I whispered. "I will sign." I watched Greg's shoulders relax. He smirked at Bianca. He thought he had won. He thought he had just stolen millions from the dumb sister. He had no idea that by signing this, I wasn't giving away the land. I was giving him the rope to hang himself with. Because I knew something he didn't. The deed required a witness from a notary public to be valid in Georgia, and without it, this piece of paper was just evidence of fraud. I pressed the pen to the paper. "Thank you, Greg," I said, signing a name that wasn't quite mine. "Thank you for showing me exactly what I am worth to you." Verna did not walk me to the guest room, because there was no guest room for me. Instead, she pointed a manicured finger toward the back of the house near the kitchen pantry. "Sleep in the storage room," she said without making eye contact. "We turned your old bedroom into a walk-in closet for Bianca, so there is nowhere else. Besides, it is just for one night. Do not get comfortable." She tossed a thin, scratchy wool blanket at me, the kind that smells of mothballs and neglect. No pillow, no sheets, just the bare mattress of a cot that looked like it had been salvaged from a prison surplus auction. I walked into the small, cramped room and closed the door. The air inside was stagnant and cold, biting at my exposed skin. This room used to be mine. 18 years of my life were spent within these 4 walls. I remembered painting them a soft lavender when I was 12, trying to create a sanctuary away from Verna's criticism. Now the walls were covered in shelves stacked high with Bianca's cast-offs. Boxes of shoes she wore, once broken humidifiers, and piles of fast fashion clothes with the tags still on. I was sleeping in the graveyard of their excess. I wrapped the thin blanket around my shoulders and sat on the edge of the cot. The springs squeaked in protest. I did not cry. The part of me that used to cry over them died 8 years ago in that Greyhound station. Instead, I sat in the darkness listening. The house was old, built in the 50s, and the walls were paper-thin. Specifically, the wall that separated this storage room from the dining room where Greg and Bianca were still sitting. I could hear the clink of the wine bottle hitting a glass. I could hear the wet sound of Greg chewing. And then I heard his voice, loud and slurred with arrogance. "I cannot believe she actually signed it." Greg laughed, a sound that vibrated through the drywall. "I thought she would put up a fight. I thought she would at least Google the property address. But she is dumber than she looks." Bianca giggled, the sound high and cruel. "She is desperate, Greg. Did you see those shoes she was wearing? She probably needs that $5,000 to pay off a loan shark or something. Honestly, we are being too generous. 5,000 is charity. I leaned my head back against the cold wall, my eyes wide open in the dark. You are right, Greg said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still perfectly audible. 5,000 is peanuts compared to the payout. I spoke to the acquisitions lead at Ethelgard Systems this morning. They are desperate for that land. Something about a geographical redundancy for their new server farm. They offered 15 million for the parcel. 15 million, Bianca. My heart stopped beating for a second and then restarted with a slow, thundering rhythm. $15 million. Ethelgard Systems. They were trying to sell my own grandmother's land to my own company. Greg continued, oblivious to the fact that the wolf was on the other side of the wall. Once the deed is recorded in our LLC name on Monday, I will flip it to Ethelgard on Tuesday. By Wednesday, we will be looking at 8 figures in the account. And Nia, she will be on a bus back to whatever hole she crawled out of, none the wiser. We are going to be set for life, baby. Bianca let out a squeal of delight. I am going to buy that Range Rover I wanted. And maybe a vacation home in Aspen. Finally, we can stop pretending to budget. I am so sick of pretending. I stared at the ceiling where a water stain shaped like a map of Florida was slowly peeling. Sick of pretending. That was rich coming from a woman wearing cubic zirconia and claiming it was diamond. They were not just mean. They were criminals. Greg was engaging in mortgage fraud and insider trading using his position at the bank to broker a deal he had a personal stake in. And he was doing it to defraud the very company he was trying to sell to. He had no idea that the acquisitions lead he spoke to reported to a vice president who reported to me. He had no idea that the signature I scrawled on that paper earlier was illegible and legally non-binding because I deliberately used my maiden name, which I legally changed 3 years ago for security reasons. Slowly, calmly, I reached into the inner pocket of my $12,000 coat, which was folded neatly beneath me to keep it off the dirty floor. I pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the dark storage room with a cold blue glow. I unlocked it and opened my secure messaging app. I found the contact listed as James' executive assistant. My thumbs moved across the screen with lethal precision. Initiate protocol Obsidian, I typed. Buy the debt on the family residence immediately. Contact legal regarding the bank acquisition. Accelerate the timeline. I want to own the branch by tomorrow morning. And James freeze any pending real estate transactions involving a shell company called G&B Holdings. I watched the 3 dots dance on the screen as James replied instantly. On it, Mrs. Johnson. Do you want us to alert the authorities regarding the fraud? I paused. Letting the police handle it would be too easy, too impersonal. I wanted to look Greg in the eye when his world crumbled. Not yet, I typed back. Bring the paperwork to the house tomorrow at noon. I will handle the eviction personally. I locked the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. Outside in the dining room, Greg was proposing a toast to easy money and stupid relatives. In the cold storage room, I pulled the scratchy blanket up to my chin and closed my eyes. For the first time in years, I was going to sleep soundly in this house. Because tomorrow I would not just be a guest. Tomorrow I would be the landlord. The sun had barely begun to filter through the cracks in the storage room blinds when the door was kicked open with a violence that shook the shelves. Dust motes danced in the sudden influx of light as Bianca stood in the doorway. She was wrapped in a pink silk robe that was clearly a knockoff of a designer brand, complete with fraying threads at the hem. She held a coffee mug with the words "Boss Babe" printed in gold glitter, looking down at me with a mixture of disgust and command. "Wake up, Cinderella," she chirped, her voice grating against the early morning silence. "Mom is up, and she is hungry. She wants blueberry pancakes. And Greg needs his eggs over easy. Do not mess it up like you messed up your life." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving the door wide open. I sat up, my back aching from the thin mattress and the cold seeping through the floorboards. The audacity was almost impressive. They lock me in a shed, try to swindle me out of millions, and then expect me to function as their personal chef. I stood up, stretching the stiffness from my limbs, and walked into the kitchen. It was a showroom of expensive appliances that looked like they had never been touched. A 6-burner stove, a double oven, a smart fridge. It was all for show, just like them. I decided to give them exactly the breakfast they deserved. I grabbed a carton of eggs and a bag of pancake mix. I turned the gas burner on high, the flame roaring to life. I did not use butter. I did not use oil. I cracked the eggs directly into the scorching hot stainless steel pan. They sizzled aggressively, the whites turning to rubber instantly and sticking to the metal. I let them sit there, the smell of burning protein beginning to fill the air. For the pancakes, I mixed the batter with too much water and poured it onto a griddle I had cranked to maximum heat. Within seconds, smoke began to rise thick and acrid. Footsteps thundered down the stairs. Greg rushed into the kitchen, followed closely by Verna. Greg was wearing silk pajamas that were too short for his legs, and his face was twisted in annoyance. "What in God's name are you doing?" he shouted, waving his hand in front of his face to disperse the smoke. "Are you trying to burn the house down?" I turned off the stove with a calm, deliberate motion. I scraped the blackened, rubbery eggs onto a plate and set it on the island in front of him. Next to it, I placed 2 charred, paper-thin pancakes. "Breakfast is served," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. Greg looked at the plate as if I had served him a dead rat. His face turned a deep shade of crimson. Verna let out a gasp of horror. "You are useless," Greg spat, pushing the plate away so hard it skidded across the counter and crashed onto the floor, shattering the porcelain and scattering burnt eggs everywhere. "You cannot even cook a simple meal. Is there anything you are actually good at, Naya? Or are you just determined to be a burden in every possible way?" He reached into the pocket of his pajama bottoms and pulled out a leather money clip. He peeled off a single $100 bill. He did not hand it to me. He crumpled it into a ball and threw it on the floor right into the mess of broken china and eggs. "Go get us some real food," he commanded, pointing at the door. "There is a bakery down the street. Buy us pastries and coffee. And try not to screw that up. Do not show your face until you have something edible in your hands. Don't make us look bad by begging." The room went silent. Verna and Bianca watched, smirks playing on their lips, waiting for my humiliation. They expected me to cry. They expected me to scramble for the money. I looked down at the crumpled bill sitting in the yoke. Slowly, I bent down. I picked it up, shaking off a piece of eggshell. I smoothed it out against my palm, taking my time. "I will take care of it," I said. I walked to the front door, opened it, and pulled out my phone. But I did not walk to the bakery. Instead, I opened a premium delivery app. I ordered $300 worth of artisanal pastries, truffle quiches, and single-origin coffee from the most expensive bistro in the city. I paid with my own black card. 20 minutes later, a delivery driver pulled up. Greg and the family were sitting in the living room fuming. I opened the door and took the heavy bags from the driver. He was a young man looking tired. "Here you go," I said loudly, making sure my voice carried into the living room. I held out the $100 bill Greg had thrown at me. The driver's eyes widened. "This is for me?" he asked, stunned. "Yes," I said, smiling. "Keep the change, buy yourself something nice." Greg's head snapped around from the sofa. He watched in horror as I handed over his money. Money he thought was a fortune. Money he used to degrade me to a complete stranger as a casual tip. I walked into the living room and dropped the bags on the coffee table. "Breakfast," I announced. Greg stared at me, his mouth slightly open. He looked at the food, then at the door where the driver was happily getting back into his car, and then back at me. He wanted to scream. He wanted to yell that I had wasted his money. But he couldn't. Because if he did, he would have to admit that $100 mattered to him. He would have to admit that the amount I just gave away as a tip was a significant loss for him. I sat down in the corner, crossing my legs, and watched him struggle to swallow his rage along with his croissant. He thought the money was a leash. He didn't realize I had just used it to choke him. By 5 o'clock that evening, the house had transformed into a stage set for a play about happiness that nobody actually knew how to act in. Verna had draped garland over every banister, and lit enough candles to create a fire hazard, all to mask the smell of desperation that permeated the walls. I stood in the hallway, watching her frantic preparations, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. I was still wearing my charcoal trench coat ready to leave at a moment's notice, but Verna had other plans. She marched up to me, holding a hanger wrapped in dry cleaning plastic. "Here," she said, thrusting the garment at me. "Put this on." I pulled back the plastic to reveal a simple black dress with a white collar. It was a uniform. Specifically, it was the uniform of the catering company Verna used to hire back when Dad was alive, and we actually had money. "You want me to wear a maid outfit?" I asked, my voice flat. "Do not be dramatic," Verna snapped, smoothing her hair in the hallway mirror. "It is not a maid outfit, it is a service dress. Look, you are going to be helping out tonight since you refused to chip in for the catering staff. I do not want you ruining your own clothes with spills. Besides, that gray thing you are wearing is depressing. It brings down the mood. This is clean and professional." She was not trying to save my clothes. She was trying to erase my identity. She wanted to make sure that to every guest walking through that door I was clearly defined as the help, not the family. "Fine," I said, taking the hanger. I went into the downstairs bathroom to change. The dress was polyester and itchy tight around the arms and loose around the waist. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked exactly like the person they wanted me to be. Small, servile, unimportant. But then I reached into my bag. I pulled out a small velvet pouch and slid its contents onto my left wrist. It was a Patek Philippe Nautilus with a rose gold casing and a chocolate brown dial. It was worth more than the entire catering budget for the next 10 years. It was my anchor, a heavy, cold reminder against my pulse that I was not the girl in the polyester dress. I was the woman who signed the checks. When I stepped out, Bianca was waiting in the foyer, adjusting her cleavage. She took one look at me and burst into a cruel laugh. "Oh wow," she giggled, covering her mouth. "You actually did it. You look appropriate. Finally dressed for the job you were born for." Then her eyes caught the glint of gold on my wrist. She reached out and grabbed my arm, pulling it closer. "What is this?" she asked, squinting at the watch. "Is that supposed to be a Patek?" "It is just a watch, Bianca," I said, pulling my arm back. She rolled her eyes. "God, Nia, you are so tacky. Buying knockoffs on Canal Street to try and impress us? It looks ridiculous. Take it off before someone notices and laughs at you. Real rich people can spot a fake from a mile away." I did not take it off. I simply clasped my hands behind my back and walked into the kitchen. The guests began to arrive shortly after. They were exactly the crowd I expected. Bianca's friends from her days pretending to be an influencer, and Greg's colleagues from the bank who were all desperate to climb the corporate ladder. They were loud. They were flashy. They wore logos like armor. The women were draped in seasons-old designer wear that did not quite fit, and the men wore suits that were too shiny. I stood by the bar holding a tray of champagne flutes filled with sparkling wine that cost $9 a bottle. "Nia, get these to the guests," Greg barked, snapping his fingers at me from across the room. "And make sure you keep the napkins coming. Mr. Sterling hates sticky fingers." I walked into the crowd, the tray balanced perfectly in my hand. I moved like a shadow, weaving through the groups of people who did not even glance at my face. I was invisible to them, just a hand holding a drink. "Thank you, sweetie," a woman said, grabbing a glass without looking at me. She turned back to her friend. "So anyway, I heard Bianca's sister is back. Can you believe it? After 8 years. Her friend took a sip and wrinkled her nose. "The one who ran away. I heard she was homeless or something. Bianca said she showed up today in rags begging for money. It is so sad, really. I do not know how Bianca deals with the embarrassment." I stood right behind them, holding the tray, my face impassive. "Actually," the woman continued, lowering her voice to a theatrical whisper, "Greg said she is mentally unstable. That is why they have her helping out tonight, to keep her busy so she does not cause a scene. They are practically saints for taking her in." I stepped forward, extending the tray. Would you ladies care for a napkin? I asked, my voice polite and cool. They jumped, startled by my presence. They looked at the black dress. They looked at the tray. They did not look at my eyes. Oh, thanks, the first woman stammered, grabbing a napkin. I walked away, a small smile playing on my lips. They called me unstable. They called me a charity case. They had no idea that the woman serving them cheap champagne was currently mentally calculating the interest rates on their maxed-out credit cards. I knew exactly who they were. I knew which of them were leasing their cars, and which of them were one paycheck away from foreclosure. My company's algorithms processed their financial data every day. I made my way to the center of the room where Greg was holding court. He was telling a story about a big deal he closed, laughing loudly at his own jokes. More drinks, Nia, he commanded when he saw me. And get me a fresh one. This one is flat. He handed me his half-empty glass, not bothering to make eye contact. I took it. Of course, Greg, I said. I walked back to the kitchen, the sounds of their laughter following me. They were enjoying their moment on top of the world. They felt powerful, giving orders to the poor relation. Let them have their fun. Let them think they were the masters of this universe. Because in less than an hour, the real owner of this world was going to step out of the shadows and turn the lights out on their party. I adjusted the Patek on my wrist, feeling its weight. The time was ticking, and their time was almost up. I stood at the kitchen sink, my hands submerged in lukewarm soapy water that was quickly turning a murky shade of gray from the lipstick stains and dregs of cheap wine. The noise from the living room was a dull roar of forced laughter and clinking glasses, a soundtrack to my servitude. I was scrubbing a particularly stubborn stain off a champagne flute when I felt a distinct rhythmic vibration against my hip. It was not a normal phone notification. It was the triple pulse of my encrypted satellite phone, a device that only 5 people in the world had the number for. I dried my hands on a dish towel and pulled the sleek titanium device from the pocket of my catering dress. The screen displayed a restricted number. It was the board of directors in Tokyo and Paris. The acquisition of Greg's bank was entering the final phase, and they needed my verbal authorization to release the funds. I tapped the screen and brought the phone to my ear, my posture shifting instantly from tired servant to commanding executive. Oui, je vous écoute, I said, my voice crisp and authoritative, slipping effortlessly into French. The terms must be absolute. I want full controlling interest by the time the market opens in New York. Non, do not negotiate. Tell them it is a hostile takeover if you must. I paused, listening to the frantic confirmation on the other end, then switched seamlessly to Japanese as the Tokyo representative chimed in. Hi, Wakari Mashita. Execute the transfer immediately. Do not wait for the morning bell. I want the board members of the bank to wake up unemployed. I was in the zone, my mind visualizing the digital flow of billions of dollars crossing oceans, dismantling the very institution Greg bragged about working for. I felt powerful. I felt like myself. Suddenly, the kitchen door swung open. Bianca stumbled in, swaying slightly in her high heels, an empty wine bottle swinging from her hand. Her face was flushed, and her eyes were glassy. She froze when she saw me, her brow furrowing in confusion as she processed the sight of her sister, the supposed failure, speaking fluent Japanese with the tone of a warlord. She blinked, shaking her head, as if to clear a hallucination. Then the confusion turned into a sneer. What are you doing? She slurred, stepping closer. Who are you talking to? And what is that gibberish? Are you pretending to speak Chinese now to impress nobody? I ignored her, finishing my sentence to the board. Proceed. I will be in touch within the hour. I moved to hang up, but Bianca was faster than she looked. Fueled by alcohol and a lifetime of entitlement, she lunged forward and snatched the phone from my hand. Give me that, she snapped. She looked at the screen, which had already gone black due to the privacy filter. She laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. I knew it. It is probably a debt collector, isn't it? You are trying to beg them for an extension in a fake language so we do not understand how broke you are. God, you are pathetic, Nia, trying to act important in a maid's dress. Bianca, give me the phone, I said, my voice deadly calm. You do not know what you are holding. Oh, I know exactly what I am holding, she taunted, dangling the device over the sink full of dirty dishwater. It is a piece of junk, just like you. You think you can come into my house, my party, and act like you have secrets. We know who you are, Nia. You are nobody. Before I could step forward, she opened her fingers. The phone dropped with a heavy splash into the basin of gray, greasy water. It sank immediately to the bottom, disappearing beneath the suds. Oops! Bianca giggled, covering her mouth with exaggerated innocence. My hand slipped. I guess you will have to communicate with your imaginary friends by smoke signal now. She leaned back against the counter, crossing her arms, waiting for me to scream. She wanted me to dive into the water in a panic. She wanted to see me cry over a lost possession. Instead, I stared at her. I did not blink. I did not shout. I simply reached into the water, my movements slow and deliberate. I felt the cold titanium casing of the phone at the bottom of the sink. I pulled it out. Water cascaded off the device. I grabbed a clean towel and dried it off. The screen lit up instantly, recognizing my biometric print. It was a military-grade prototype, waterproof up to 50 meters, and virtually indestructible. I checked the connection. The call had ended, but the execution command had been sent. The deal was done. I looked up at Bianca, who was frowning, annoyed that her little stunt had failed to produce a breakdown. You are so weird, she muttered. It is just a phone. Get a new one at the gas station. I took a step closer to her, invading her personal space, until she backed up against the refrigerator. That is not just a phone, Bianca. I said, my voice low and smooth, like velvet over gravel. That is a custom encrypted device, made of aerospace titanium. It contains hardware that does not exist on the consumer market yet. I held it up so she could see the lack of charging ports or buttons, the seamless design. This device costs $20,000 to manufacture. I continued, watching her eyes widen. And the software on it manages assets worth more than the GDP of a small country. I leaned in, whispering the final blow into her ear. You make what, $35,000 a year as a receptionist? You just threw 6 months of your salary into the sink because you were jealous. Be careful, little sister. You can't afford to make mistakes like that when you are about to be unemployed. Bianca opened her mouth to argue, to tell me I was lying, but the look in my eyes stopped her. For the first time all night, she looked unsure. She looked at the phone, then at me, and I saw a flicker of genuine fear behind the drunken haze. I turned back to the sink and dropped the towel. Now, if you will excuse me, I said, turning my back on her. I have more glasses to wash before your guests get thirsty. I walked back into the living room, where the atmosphere had shifted from forced politeness to boisterous arrogance. The wine was flowing freely now, and with every glass the volume of the conversation rose. Greg had positioned himself by the fireplace, one arm resting on the mantel, holding court with a group of 4 other men. They were his colleagues from the bank, and a few of Bianca's friends' husbands, all wearing suits that looked shiny under the chandelier lights. They leaned in, listening to Greg with the kind of greedy admiration that mediocre men reserve for whoever they think is making the most money in the room. I stood by the archway, holding a tray of empty glasses I had just collected. I was invisible to them. To them, I was just the help part of the furniture, a background character in the movie of their successful lives. I watched Greg gesture wildly, with his drink sloshing a bit of red wine onto the carpet he claimed was so precious just hours ago. Gentlemen, Greg announced, his voice booming. You are looking at a man who is about to retire at 40. I am telling you, the deal of the century is sitting in my safe right now. One of the men, a short guy with a receding hairline, laughed. Come on, Greg. You always have a big deal. Is this like the crypto scheme last year? Greg shook his head, looking offended. No, this is real estate. Hard assets. My wife's family has this plot of land down in Georgia. 50 acres. Belonged to the grandmother. Now to the untrained eye it looks like a swamp. But I did my homework. I have a buddy in zoning who tipped me off. I took a step closer, my heart rate steady, but my senses sharpened. This was it. The confession. I reached up to my collar and adjusted the small pearl brooch pinned to the black polyester dress. It looked like a piece of costume jewelry, something Verna might have bought at a department store sale. In reality, it was a high-fidelity directional microphone with a localized storage drive designed for corporate espionage. I tapped it once, a movement so subtle it looked like I was just scratching an itch. The device hummed silently against my collarbone. Recording active. Greg took a long swig of his wine and lowered his voice slightly, leaning in to share the secret. So get this. The sister, the one in the kitchen washing dishes right now, she is the heir. But let's just say she is not playing with a full deck, desperate for cash. I waved $5,000 in front of her face and she practically drooled. She signed the quitclaim deed an hour ago. The men chuckled, shaking their heads. $5,000 for 50 acres. That is robbery, Greg. It is business, Greg corrected with a smirk. The moment that deed is recorded on Monday, I am flipping it. I have a buyer lined up. A massive tech conglomerate called Ethelgard Systems. They need the land for a server farm or something. The opening offer was $15 million. $15 million. The number hung in the air. The men went silent, their eyes wide with envy. $15 million, Greg repeated, savoring the taste of the words. And I got it for the price of a used Honda. That is a 3,000% return on investment, boys. That is how you play the game. The sister thinks she won the lottery getting $5,000. She has no idea she just handed me the keys to the kingdom. I stood there feeling the recording device capture every syllable. He had just admitted to fraud. He had admitted to deceiving a seller about the value of an asset while acting as a fiduciary. He had admitted to insider knowledge. It was enough to strip him of his banking license. It was enough to send him to federal prison. Suddenly, Greg's eyes locked onto me across the room. His smile faded into a scowl of annoyance. Hey, you, Nia. He snapped his fingers, the sound sharp and dismissive. We are running low on ice over here. My drink is getting warm. Stop standing around daydreaming and get more ice. Nosh. Chop chop. The other men turned to look at me. They did not see the CEO of the company Greg was trying to defraud. They saw a woman in a cheap dress being ordered around. One of them smirked and held up his glass. Yeah, top me off too, sweetie. I lowered my head, hiding the triumphant gleam in my eyes. Right away, Greg, I said obediently. I walked over to them, moving deep into their circle to collect the empty ice bucket. I needed to be close. I needed one more thing on the tape. I picked up the bucket and looked at Greg with wide, innocent eyes. Greg, I asked softly, are you sure it is okay to sell Grandma's land? Mom said it was just for a landfill. You are not doing anything risky, are you? Greg laughed, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. It was patronizing and heavy. Do not worry your pretty little empty head about it, Nia. Leave the finance to the experts. You just worry about the ice. That is about your speed. He turned back to his friends, dismissing me completely. See, clueless. Absolutely clueless. I turned and walked away, clutching the ice bucket. The recording was perfect. He had mocked me, admitted to the lie, and confirmed his intent to deceive all in high-definition audio. I walked back toward the kitchen, my footsteps light. He thought he was the shark in the tank. He didn't realize he was bleeding and I was the one with the teeth. I pushed open the kitchen door and set the bucket down. I tapped the pearl brooch again. Recording saved, uploading to cloud. I looked at the reflection in the oven door. The woman staring back at me was not a servant. She was the executioner, and the guillotine was ready to drop. The doorbell chimed a melody that was far too cheerful for the tension suffocating the room. It was the sound Greg had been waiting for all night. He practically jumped out of his skin, smoothing his tie and checking his reflection in the hallway mirror with frantic vanity. This was the main event. Mr. Sterling, the CEO of the bank, and the man Greg worshipped like a deity had arrived. Verna immediately turned on me, her eyes wide with panic. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into the polyester fabric of the catering dress. Get back in the kitchen, she hissed. shoving me toward the swinging door. "Do not let Mr. Sterling see you. You look like a depressed maid. We are trying to project success here, Nia. Having you lurking around with that sullen face will ruin the aesthetic. Stay out of sight until I call for you. And for God's sake, fix your hair. You look wild." I allowed her to push me. I stepped backward into the kitchen, letting the door swing shut, but not all the way. I left a sliver of space open, just enough to see and hear everything. I needed to witness this performance. Greg opened the front door with a flourish. "Mr. Sterling." "Welcome, welcome," Greg boomed, bowing slightly. "It is such an honor to have you in my humble abode. Please come in. Can I take your coat?" Mr. Sterling stepped inside. He was a large man with silver hair and a suit that cost more than Greg's car. But tonight he did not look like a titan of industry. He looked haggard. There were dark circles under his eyes and his tie was slightly askew. He looked like a man who had been running from a predator he could not see. "Good evening," Greg Sterling muttered, handing over his coat without looking at him. "Nice place. A bit festive." "Thank you, sir." Greg beamed, missing the sarcasm entirely. "We try to keep standards high. Please come to the living room. Let me get you a drink. Scotch neat. I have the 20-year-old bottle you like." As they walked into the living room, the other guests fell silent, sensing the arrival of true power. Greg practically skipped to the bar, pouring a generous glass of whiskey. Sterling took it and downed half of it in one gulp. He let out a long, ragged sigh. "Rough day at the office, sir?" Greg asked, trying to sound casual but failing. "Rough is not the word for it," Sterling said, his voice carrying across the room. "It is a bloodbath, Greg. You have seen the internal memos. We are bleeding. The stock dropped another 4 points today, and the rumors are true. We are being circled." Greg nodded solemnly, putting on his serious banker face. "The acquisition rumors. I told the boys it is just market noise. We are too big to fall, right, sir?" Sterling shook his head grimly. "This is not noise. It is a hostile takeover. Someone is buying up our debt, buying up our shares, surrounding us like a pack of wolves. And the worst part is, we do not know who it is. The street calls the buyer the Ghost. No name, no face, just a massive influx of capital from a holding company that leads nowhere. They are tearing us apart piece by piece, and I cannot get a single meeting with the principal." I stood in the shadows of the kitchen, a cold smile touching my lips. The Ghost! I liked that nickname. It suited me. For 8 years I had been a ghost to my family. Now I was a ghost to their financial security. Greg leaned in, lowering his voice to a confidential whisper that was intended to impress the room. "Actually, sir, I might have some good news on that front." Sterling looked up, his eyebrows raised. "What do you mean, Greg? Do not toy with me." "I am not toying, sir," Greg said, puffed up with self-importance. "I did some digging. You know I have my ear to the ground. I have it on good authority that the entity behind this is Ethelgard Systems." Sterling's eyes widened. "Ethelgard? The tech giant? Are you sure?" Greg nodded sagely. 100%. And here is the kicker, sir. I actually know the CEO. We go way back. We used to play golf together at the club before he moved to the West Coast. He is a good guy. A bit aggressive, sure, but reasonable. I had to cover my mouth to stop a laugh from escaping. I had never played golf in my life. And I was certainly not a he. Greg was lying through his teeth, inventing a relationship with a fictional man to secure his position. It was pathetic. It was dangerous. And it was exactly what I needed him to do. Sterling looked at Greg with a mixture of disbelief and hope. "You know him personally. You know the CEO of Ethelgard." Greg took a sip of his wine, basking in the attention. "Intimately. In fact, I was planning to give him a call on Monday. Smooth things over. Make sure the transition protects our jobs, especially yours and mine, sir. I can probably get us a sweet deal. Maybe even a promotion for the team who facilitated the introduction." Sterling looked relieved. He clapped a hand on Greg's shoulder. Greg, if you can pull that off, you are not just an employee. You are a savior. I had no idea you were so well connected. Why didn't you mention this earlier? Greg shrugged, feigning modesty. I do not like to brag, sir. I prefer to let my results speak for themselves. But do not worry. I will handle the ghost. He listens to me. I leaned my head against the doorframe, watching them. Greg was digging his own grave with a golden shovel. He had just promised his boss that he could control a person. He had never met a person he was currently treating like a servant in his own home. He promised to tame the ghost. He had no idea that the ghost was about to walk out of the kitchen with a tray of appetizers and destroy him. From the hallway, Verna hissed at me. Nia, what are you doing standing there? Mr. Sterling looks hungry. Get the crab cakes out there now, and keep your head down. I straightened my back. I picked up the silver tray of crab cakes. Coming. Verna, I whispered. I pushed the door open and stepped into the light. It was time to feed the lions. Here is the script for Part 11 written in English, as requested following the continuous narrative style and formatting constraints. The crab cakes were gone, and the wine was flowing freely when Verna clapped her hands together, demanding everyone's attention. It was time for the gift exchange. This was a tradition my mother cherished not because of the spirit of giving, but because it was another opportunity for her to perform her role as the benevolent matriarch. We gathered in the living room, the guests forming a semicircle around the fireplace, where a pile of beautifully wrapped boxes sat waiting. Greg and Bianca sat on the plush sofa, looking like royalty, while I stood awkwardly to the side near the Christmas tree, still wearing my black catering dress. Verna handed out gifts to the guests, first expensive bottles of scotch, and designer scarves bought with credit cards that were likely maxed out. Then she turned to me. The room went quiet. She reached behind the tree and pulled out a small, lumpy package wrapped in crumpled newspaper. Here, Nia, she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. I know things have been hard for you, so I wanted to give you something practical. I took the package. It felt soft and light. I peeled back the newspaper to reveal 3 pairs of wool socks. They were not new. The heels were worn thin, almost see-through, and one of them had a distinct hole near the toe. They smelled faintly of mothballs. I found them in your father's old trunk. Verna continued, wiping a non-existent tear from her eye. I thought you could use them. It gets cold on the streets or wherever it is you are staying. It is not much, but it comes from the heart. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the room. Greg snorted into his drink. Better put those on now, Nia, he called out. Matches the rest of your outfit. Bianca stood up, then holding a thin envelope. She walked over to me, swaying slightly in her heels, a malicious grin plastered on her face. I have something for you too, big sister, she announced, handing me the envelope. I was going to use this myself, but honestly, I felt bad for you. I know how much you love a bargain. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single coupon for a discount grocery store. It was for 10% off canned tuna. I looked at the date. It had expired 3 months ago. Bianca covered her mouth, giggling. Oops, I think it might be a little out of date, but maybe if you beg the manager, they will still honor it. You are good at begging, right? The room erupted. The guests were laughing openly now, finding the spectacle of the poor servant sister hilarious. Mr. Sterling stood in the back, watching with a furrowed brow, looking uncomfortable but saying nothing. I looked at the socks in my hand. Then I looked at the coupon. I did not feel shame. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a trap snapping shut. Thank you, Bianca, I said, my voice cutting through the laughter like a knife. Thank you, Verna. Your generosity is truly overwhelming. I reached into the deep pocket of my catering apron. I actually have a gift for you too, Bianca, I said. The room went silent. Bianca looked surprised. She blinked her false eyelashes, looking at the thick, cream-colored envelope I had pulled out. It was heavy, sealed with red wax. For me, she asked, reaching for it. What is it? Did you draw me a picture? Or maybe you found $5 on the sidewalk? She snatched the envelope from my hand and tore it open, expecting a joke. She pulled out a stack of legal documents stapled together at the top. She stared at the first page. Her smile faltered. Then it vanished completely. "What is this?" she whispered, her hands beginning to shake. "Read it out loud, Bianca," I said, stepping closer to her. "Read it so everyone can hear." She shook her head, scanning the document frantically. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and sickly beneath her heavy makeup. "I do not understand," she stammered. "This says, summons, court appearance." "Keep reading," I commanded. "It is a lawsuit," she choked out. For identity theft, grand larceny, fraud." Greg stood up, his face red. "What the hell is this, Nia? You are suing your own sister on Christmas." I turned to face the room, addressing the guests as much as my family. 8 years ago, I left this house, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I had perfect credit. I had savings. And then one day, I woke up to find my accounts drained and credit cards opened in my name, maxed out to the limit of $50,000. I pointed at Bianca, who was now trembling violently. She stole my social security number. She used my identity to fund her first round of plastic surgery and buy that car she crashed a month later. She ruined my financial life before it even started. That is why I had to leave. That is why I had to start from zero. Bianca dropped the papers. They scattered on the floor, $50,000 worth of debt plus 8 years of interest. I was just a kid," she cried, looking at Verna for help. "Mom told me you would not mind. She said we were family and you would want to help me look my best." Verna gasped, clutching her pearls. "I never said such a thing, Bianca. Do not drag me into your mess." I picked up one of the pages from the floor. "The statute of limitations was about to run out," I said calmly. "But I filed this yesterday. And Bianca, since you clearly do not have the money to pay me back, I took the liberty of buying the debt collection agency that holds your portfolio." I leaned in close to her terrified face. "So you do not owe the bank anymore. You owe me. And unlike the bank, I do not offer payment plans. I want it all. Or I will see you in a cell." Bianca looked at the expired coupon still in my hand. The joke wasn't funny anymore. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Greg setting his glass down with a shaky hand. They thought they were mocking a pauper. They just realized they were mocking the executioner. "This is a lie!" Bianca shrieked, her voice cracking as she scrambled to pick up the papers, crinkling them in her desperation. "You forged these. Mom tell them she forged them. I never stole anything." She looked around the room, her eyes wild, pleading with the guests to believe her performance of the victim. "Nia has always been jealous of me. She is trying to frame me because I am happy and she is miserable." Verna immediately stepped between us, shielding Bianca with her body like a lioness protecting a cub, though this cub was a grown woman with a drinking problem and a history of fraud. Verna glared at me, her face contorted with that familiar mix of disappointment and rage. "Nia, stop this instant," she hissed. "Look at what you are doing. You are embarrassing your sister in front of her friends. Even if she did use a little bit of your credit, so what? You are the older sister. It is your duty to take care of her. You left us, remember? You abandoned your family. The least you could do was help her out financially. Why are you being so petty over money?" The room went deadly silent. The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Even Verna's twisted logic sounded insane when said out loud, that I was somehow responsible for funding my sister's criminal lifestyle because I had escaped their abuse. "Petty," I repeated the word, tasting like ash. "You call $50,000 petty. You call ruining my credit score so badly I could not rent an apartment for 2 years petty." I took a step forward, ignoring Verna, and looking directly at Greg, who was shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He was starting to do the math. He was realizing that if his wife was being sued for fraud, his assets might be on the line too. "Let us look at the itemized list, shall we?" I said. my voice projecting clearly to the back of the room where Mr. Sterling stood, watching intently. I pulled another sheet from the envelope. Exhibit A, October 12th, 8 years ago. $8,000 to Dr. Robert Evans. Bianca gasped, her hand flying up to cover her nose. You told everyone you fell off a bike, I said, tilting my head. But according to the billing statement charged to my Visa, it was a cosmetic rhinoplasty. My credit paid for the nose on your face right now, Bianca. A murmur went through the crowd. Someone stifled a laugh. Bianca turned a deep shade of crimson. Exhibit B, I continued, relentless. November 5th, $4,000 at a boutique in Soho for 3 designer handbags. I looked at the bag sitting at her feet near the sofa. Is that one of them? The one you told Greg was a gift from a wealthy client. Because according to the police report filed when you tried to return them for cash, they were verified knockoffs and you pocketed the difference. Greg's head snapped toward Bianca. You told me that was a limited edition Birkin, he muttered, his voice tight. And my personal favorite, I said, reading the final line on the page. December 20th. A wire transfer of $12,000 to a Mr. Zane Williams, also known by his stage name DJ Z Money. Bianca let out a sob. He was going to be a star. He just needed equipment. He was a drug dealer, Bianca, I corrected coldly. And you used my identity to fund his startup. So Verna, tell me again how this was my duty. Was it my duty to buy her a new nose? Was it my duty to finance her criminal boyfriend? Verna sputtered, grasping for a defense. She was young. She made mistakes. That is what family does, Nia. We forgive. We do not drag each other to court. You kicked me out for refusing to marry a stranger, I countered. You did not forgive me for having a spine. So why should I forgive her for having a felony? The air in the room was thick with tension. The party was officially dead. The guests were no longer drinking, they were staring at the floor, at the ceiling, anywhere but at the train wreck happening in front of them. But Greg was looking at Bianca with a dawning horror. He was not looking at her with love anymore. He was looking at her like she was a liability. Is this true? Greg asked, his voice low and dangerous. Did you really steal her identity? It does not matter, Bianca wailed, grabbing his arm. It was years ago. She is just doing this to ruin us. It matters, Greg said, pulling his arm away from her grip. Because if there is a judgment against you, does that debt become marital property? He looked at me, fear in his eyes. He was not worried about morality. He was worried about his bank account. He was worried about his precious reputation. Oh, it gets better, Greg, I said, smiling without showing my teeth. Because the lawsuit names you as a co-defendant. Since you have been commingling assets and using funds derived from her inheritance, which we now know is fraudulent to pay for this house, my lawyers argue that you have been benefiting from the proceeds of her crime. Greg went pale. He dropped his glass. It hit the rug, the $50,000 rug, and spilled red wine everywhere, staining the white wool like blood. Nobody moved to clean it up. You cannot do that, Greg whispered. I already did, I replied. And just so you know, the process server is waiting outside. I told him to wait until after the gift exchange. I did not want to be rude. I looked at Verna, whose face was frozen in a mask of shock. Any other comments about my duty, Mother? I asked. She said nothing. She just stared at the red wine spreading across the floor, realizing that the stain was never going to come out. Just like the truth. Just as Verna opened her mouth to launch another defense of her criminal daughter, a sound cut through the tension like a siren. It was the urgent rhythmic chime of the breaking news alert from the 60-inch flat-screen television mounted above the fireplace. Greg had left the financial news channel running all night on low volume, a subtle flex to show his guests that he was a man who kept his finger on the pulse of the global market. Now that vanity was about to become his undoing, the volume seemed to swell as the red banner flashed across the bottom of the screen. Breaking news. The chatter in the room, which had already died down to a terrified whisper, vanished completely. Every eye turned toward the glowing screen. The anchor, a woman with sharp features and a serious expression, looked directly into the camera. We interrupt this broadcast with a major development from Wall Street, she announced, her voice crisp and urgent. The hostile takeover of National Investment Bank has been completed in a stunning after-hours deal. The identity of the mysterious buyer, known until now only as the Ghost, has finally been revealed. Greg went rigid. His glass of wine hovered halfway to his mouth. Mr. Sterling took a step forward, squinting at the screen, his face draining of color. The acquisition was executed by Ethelgard Systems in an all-cash transaction valued at $4.2 billion, the anchor continued. This move consolidates Ethelgard's position as the dominant force in global fintech. And for the first time, we have confirmation of the leadership behind this secretive tech giant. The screen changed. The graphic of the stock market ticker disappeared, replaced by a high-resolution full-screen image. It was the cover of the upcoming issue of Forbes magazine. And there I was. The woman on the screen was undeniable. I was wearing a bespoke white power suit that cost more than the down payment on Greg's house. My arms were crossed, my chin tilted up, exuding an air of untouchable authority. The headline next to my face read in bold, uncompromising letters, Nia Johnson. The phantom billionaire comes out of the shadows. In the living room, the silence was absolute. It was a physical weight pressing down on everyone's chest. The air left the room. The anchor's voice continued, oblivious to the destruction she was causing in suburbia. Nia Johnson, a prodigy in artificial intelligence and cybersecurity, founded Ethelgard 8 years ago. Known for her ruthless efficiency and complete anonymity, Johnson has quietly built an empire that now controls the infrastructure of 3 major banking systems. With this purchase of National Investment Bank, she becomes one of the most powerful figures in American finance. Slowly, painfully, heads began to turn. It was a synchronized movement, like a scene from a horror movie, where the victims realize the killer has been in the room the whole time. They looked at the television screen where the billionaire titan stared down with eyes of steel. Then they looked at the woman standing by the Christmas tree. They looked at me. I was wearing a cheap, scratchy black polyester catering dress. My hair was pulled back in a severe bun. I was holding a tray of dirty napkins. The contrast was so violent, so absurd, that for a moment their brains refused to process it. They looked back at the screen, then back at me. I saw the moment the realization hit Mr. Sterling. He looked from the Forbes cover to my face, tracing the identical line of my jaw, the shape of my eyes. He made a sound that was half gasp, half whimper. He realized that the woman he had ignored all night, the woman whose brother-in-law had forced her to serve crab cakes, was the new owner of his career. Greg was shaking his head, a manic frozen smile plastered on his face. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. That is a coincidence. It is a deep fake. It is a prank. That is Nia. She washes dishes. She is broke. Look at her. She is wearing a maid's uniform." He pointed a shaking finger at me, desperate to convince himself, desperate to keep his reality from shattering into a million pieces. "Tell them, Nia," Greg pleaded, his eyes wild. "Tell them it is a joke. Tell them you are not her." I slowly lowered the tray of napkins onto a side table. I reached up and pulled the pin from my hair, letting it fall around my shoulders, just like in the photo. I stood up to my full height, shedding the posture of the servant I had played so well. I looked at the TV screen, then looked directly at Greg. "I think it is a good picture, don't you, Greg?" I said, my voice matching the cool authority of the woman on the news. "Although I do prefer the white suit. This polyester is terrible for my skin." Verna let out a strangled cry and grabbed the back of the sofa to steady herself. Bianca dropped her wineglass, shattering another stain onto the rug, but this time nobody cared about the floor. The world as they knew it had just ended. The ghost was real, and she was standing right in front of them. The sound of crystal shattering against the hardwood floor was louder than a gunshot in the silent room. Mr. Sterling's hand had gone completely limp. The glass of 20-year-old scotch that Greg had poured with such pride was now a puddle of amber liquid soaking into his expensive Italian loafers. But he did not even look down. His eyes were locked on me. They were wide, terrified, and filled with a sudden devastating recognition that seemed to suck the air right out of his lungs. He looked at the television screen where my face was plastered in high definition under the Forbes headline, and then he looked back at me, standing by the Christmas tree with my hair down and my posture straight. The connection fired in his brain like a short circuit. I could see the blood drain from his face, leaving him ghostly pale. He was putting it all together, the hostile takeover, the mysterious buyer known as the Ghost, the rumors of a ruthlessly efficient female CEO, and the woman standing in his employee's living room whom he had ignored all evening. Mr. Sterling. Sir. Greg stammered, stepping forward and reaching out a hand to steady his boss. Are you all right? Did the wine go to your head? I can get you some water. Don't not worry about the glass. The maid will clean it up. He gestured dismissively toward me, still unable to comprehend the reality unfolding before him. But Mr. Sterling did not take the water. He did not even look at Greg. With a sudden violent motion, he slapped Greg's hand away as if he had been touched by something contagious. Get away from me, you imbecile, Sterling hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. He stumbled forward, pushing past a stunned Greg, and practically ran across the room toward me. He moved with a desperation I had never seen in a man of his stature. He stopped just 2 feet away from me, breathing heavily. His eyes darted over my face, tracing the features he had just seen on the global news. Then, to the shock of everyone in the room, the CEO of the National Investment Bank bowed. It was not a polite nod. It was a deep, respectful bow from the waist, the kind reserved for royalty or the person who holds your life in their hands. Chairman Johnson Sterling choked out, his voice cracking. I had no idea. Please forgive me. I did not know you were present. If I had known, I would never have allowed this. He gestured vaguely at the catering dress, at the tray of napkins, at the sheer disrespect of the entire evening. He looked like he was about to be sick. Chairman Johnson. The title hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Greg let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh that sounded like a hyena choking. He looked from Sterling to me and back again, shaking his head frantically. Chairman. Sir, you are mistaken. You are confused. That is just Nia. She is my sister-in-law. She is a dishwasher. She has been in the kitchen scrubbing pots all night. Look at her dress. She is practically homeless. Greg rushed forward, grabbing Sterling's arm, trying to pull him back to the safety of their shared delusion. She tricked you, sir. Greg insisted, his eyes wild. It is a resemblance. That is all. She probably hired someone to make a fake video. She is a fraud. Tell him, Nia. Tell him you are a nobody before I call the police. Mr. Sterling spun around, his face purple with fury. He shoved Greg backwards so hard that Greg stumbled and fell onto the sofa next to a terrified Verna. Shut your mouth, Sterling roared. Do you have any idea who you are talking to? That is not a dishwasher. That is the woman who bought our bank 3 hours ago. That is the woman who owns your mortgage, your car, and your entire career. Sterling turned back to me, his hands clasping together in a plea. Chairman Johnson, please understand. I had no knowledge of your relationship to this employee. Greg told me you were uneducated. He told me you were a charity case. I swear on my life I did not know. I looked at Mr. Sterling. He was sweating profusely. I looked at Greg, who was gasping for air on the sofa, looking like a fish thrown onto dry land. It is interesting, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice cool and even. Because just 10 minutes ago, Greg told this entire room that he was a close personal friend of the CEO of Ethelgard. He said he played golf with him. He said he had the inside track. I took a step toward Greg, looking down at him with pity. So tell me, Greg, when exactly did we play golf? Was it before or after you ordered me to clean up your spilled wine? Greg opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in 8 years. And in my eyes he did not see the sister-in-law he could bully. He saw the end of his world. Mr. Sterling. I continued, turning back to the trembling CEO. I believe we have a transition meeting scheduled for tomorrow morning at 8. However, given the gross incompetence and lack of judgment displayed by your senior management team, I think we should start the restructuring right now. Sterling nodded vigorously, terrified to disagree. Anything you say, Chairman. Anything at all. I smiled. It was a small, sharp smile. Good. Then let us begin with the immediate termination of the employee who just called his new boss a fraud. Greg was still sputtering, his face a mask of sweaty denial, trying to convince Mr. Sterling that this was all some elaborate prank orchestrated by a jealous sibling. He looked pathetic, like a man trying to hold back the tide with a teaspoon. I decided it was time to stop the charade. I was done playing the role of the poor relation. I was done making myself small so they could feel big. Slowly, deliberately, I reached behind my back and located the knot of the grease-stained catering apron Verna had forced me to wear. I pulled the string. The knot came loose with a soft hiss of fabric. I pulled the apron over my head, bunching the cheap, smelly polyester in my fist. I turned to Verna, who was huddled on the sofa, clutching her pearls as if they could protect her from the truth. I think you can finish the cleanup yourself, Mother, I said, my voice calm and carrying to every corner of the silent room. I tossed the balled-up apron. It sailed through the air and landed with a soft thud right in her lap. She flinched as if I had thrown a live grenade. She stared down at the dirty fabric, then up at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She wanted to yell, to reprimand me for my disrespect, but the fear in Mr. Sterling's eyes had finally trickled down to her. She stayed silent. Next, I raised my hands to my hair. For hours, my scalp had been aching from the severe tight bun Verna had insisted upon to make me look like help. I found the pins holding it in place and pulled them out one by one, dropping them onto the hardwood floor. They made a tiny, rhythmic clicking sound as they hit the wood. With a shake of my head, my hair cascaded down around my shoulders, framing my face in soft waves. The transformation was instant. The severe, tired servant vanished. In her place stood the woman from the magazine cover. The angle of my chin, the set of my shoulders, the fire in my eyes, it was undeniable now. I saw the guests gasp. The resemblance was no longer just a resemblance. It was a mirror image. From the back of the room near the entrance where the coats were kept, two men stepped forward. They had been standing there all night, blending in so perfectly that Greg had assumed they were drivers or waiters. One of them was James, my head of security and personal assistant. He was a mountain of a man in a bespoke suit that cost more than Greg's car. He walked through the crowd of stunned onlookers carrying a garment bag. The guests parted for him like the Red Sea. James stopped in front of me and bowed his head slightly, ignoring the slack-jawed family members around us. "Your jacket." Chairman James said, his voice deep and respectful. He unzipped the bag and held out a white blazer, structured and sharp, the exact same one I had worn for the Forbes photo shoot. I slipped my arms into it. It fit like armor. As I buttoned it, I felt the last remnants of Nia, the victim, melt away. I adjusted the lapels and turned my gaze to Greg. He was trembling now. He looked at Mr. Sterling, who was practically bowing on the floor, and then he looked at me. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked terror. I took a step toward him. The click of my boots on the floor was the only sound in the room. "You asked for a diagram earlier, Greg," I said, my voice smooth and lethal. "You wanted to know how money works. You wanted to teach me about financial literacy." I gestured to the room, to the terrified guests, to the spilled wine, to the fraudulent contract on the table. "Let me simplify it for you. Money is power, and right now I have all of it." Greg swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Nia, please," he whispered. "I didn't know. How could I know? You never said anything. We are family." I laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. "Family," I repeated. "Is that what we are? Because 5 minutes ago I was a charity case, 10 minutes ago I was a mental patient, and just before that you were bragging to your friends about stealing from me." I leaned in closer, invading his personal space, until I could smell the fear and stale scotch on his breath. You called me a dishwasher, Greg. You looked at the chairman of the company that just bought your bank, the woman who holds the fate of your entire career in her hands, and you called her a dishwasher. I paused, letting the words hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. So, tell me, Greg, do you think a dishwasher has the authority to fire a vice president? Because I am fairly certain I just did. Greg's knees gave out. He collapsed back onto the sofa next to Verna, burying his face in his hands. The room remained silent save for the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic beating of hearts that knew with absolute certainty that the reckoning had arrived. I turned to James. "Get my car," I said. "We have work to do. And James, make sure Mr. Sterling has the termination papers ready for signature by morning. I want this mess cleaned up." Mr. Sterling stared at Greg with a look of pure revulsion. In the world of high finance, greed was common, but getting caught on tape admitting to a felony was a cardinal sin that could bring down the entire institution. Sterling knew that if he did not sever the limb immediately, the rot would spread to him. He straightened his spine, desperate to prove his loyalty to the new owner standing before him. "Greg Miller." Sterling announced, his voice shaking, but loud enough to echo off the vaulted ceiling. "Effective immediately, you are terminated for cause. You are stripped of your title, your pension, and all unvested stock options. Security will escort you from the building tomorrow, only to collect personal effects that are not considered evidence in the pending investigation." Greg looked up from the sofa, his eyes bloodshot and wide with disbelief. The air seemed to leave his lungs in a rush. Terminated, he choked out the word, tasting like bile. "You can't do that. You can't just fire me. I have a mortgage. I have a lease on the Mercedes. I have a reputation." "You have a federal indictment waiting for you," I corrected coldly. "And since you used bank resources and company time to facilitate this attempted fraud, I imagine Mr. Sterling will be fully cooperating with the SEC to save his own license. Won't you, Mr. Sterling?" "Absolutely," Sterling said quickly, not daring to look Greg in the eye. "We will hand over all his emails, call logs, and transaction history. The bank disavows any knowledge of his private dealings." Greg scrambled off the sofa. He fell to his knees, crawling toward me across the very rug he had forbidden me to walk on. He grabbed the hem of my white trousers, his hands shaking violently. It was a pathetic sight. The man who had thrown a crumpled $100 bill at me this morning, the man who had treated me like a stray dog, was now begging at my feet. "Nia, please," he sobbed, snot running down his nose. "I am sorry. I was just trying to get ahead. I did it for the family, for Bianca. Please don't let them fire me. We will lose everything. The house, the cars. We won't have anywhere to go. You can't do this to family." I looked down at him. I searched inside myself for a flicker of pity, a spark of the sisterly affection Verna claimed I should have. I found nothing. Just the cold, hard detachment of a judge delivering a sentence to a guilty man. "You should have thought about family before you tried to steal my grandmother's land," I said, my voice devoid of warmth. "You should have thought about that before you locked me in a storage shed and mocked my poverty." I pulled my leg away from his grasp, stepping back as if he were something unclean. "You love to talk about economics, don't you, Greg?" I asked, looking down at his trembling form. "You love to lecture people about market forces and financial literacy. You told me this morning that I needed to understand how the world works." I raised my hand and pointed toward the front door, the heavy oak door that he had opened with such arrogance only hours ago. "Well, here's your chance to learn about the economy from the ground up," I said, my eyes boring into his. "Get out. Go analyze the market for begging on the street corner, because that is the only sector you are qualified for now." Greg stared at me, broken. He looked at Bianca, hoping for defense, but she turned her face away, unable to look at a loser. He looked at Verna, but she was staring at the wall, catatonic. He was alone. "Get out!" I repeated, my voice like a whip crack. "Before I have James throw you out." Greg stumbled to his feet, sobbing openly. He looked around the room at the guests who were watching his destruction with morbid fascination. He let out a wail of despair and ran for the door, not even stopping to grab his coat. The door slammed shut behind him, shaking the house. I turned back to the room, adjusting my cuffs. "Now," I said to the stunned silence, "does anyone else have a lesson on finance they would like to share?" The heavy front door had clicked shut behind Greg, but his wails of despair seemed to linger in the foyer like a bad smell. The guests remained frozen in their spots, their champagne warm in their hands, staring at me with a mixture of awe and terror. They were witnessing a public execution of a family's status, and they could not look away. Mr. Sterling stood by the fireplace, wiping sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief, looking like a man who had just survived a plane crash. I turned my attention to the dining table, where the fraudulent quitclaim deed still sat, the ink on my fake signature barely dry. Beside it lay the manila envelope Verna had presented with such faux benevolence. I walked over to the table, the sound of my heels distinct and rhythmic on the hardwood floor. I picked up the document. "You know," I began, my voice conversational, but carrying a dangerous undercurrent. "Greg was right about one thing. He did his homework. He just didn't do enough of it." I looked at Verna, who was still slumped on the sofa, her face a mask of gray shock. Beside her, Bianca was gnawing on her fingernail, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an exit or a miracle. "He told you this land was a swamp," I said, waving the paper slightly. "He told you it was fit only for industrial waste. He said $50,000 was a generous offer for 50 acres of dirt." I ripped the paper in half. The sound was sharp and final. "He was lying to you, of course. But he was also lying to himself. He thought he could sell it to Ethelgard for 15 million. He thought that was the ceiling." I dropped the torn pieces of the deed onto the floor, letting them flutter down onto the wine-stained rug. What Greg failed to discover in his hasty, greedy research is what lies beneath the topsoil. My geologist surveyed that land 3 months ago using satellite imaging. I motioned to James, who stepped forward and handed me a thick, leather-bound folder. I opened it and pulled out a geological map vibrant with colors indicating mineral density. I held it up for the room to see. "This is a survey of Grandma's property," I announced. "That red clay isn't just dirt. It sits directly atop one of the largest unmined veins of lithium and rare earth elements in the state of Georgia. It is essential for the production of next-generation batteries for electric vehicles, and coincidentally the hardware my company manufactures." Bianca stopped chewing her nail. She stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on the map. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It means," I said, looking her dead in the eye, "that the land isn't worth 50,000. And it isn't worth 15 million. I pulled a second document from the folder. It was a government contract stamped with the official seal of the Department of Energy. I signed this contract this morning at 6:00 a.m. directly with the federal government and my own mining division. I bypassed the middlemen. I bypassed the banks. I bypassed Greg. The confirmed valuation of the mineral rights for that property is $50 million. The number hit the room like a physical blow. 50 million. Bianca let out a sound that was not human. It was a strangled, high-pitched screech of pure agony. Her knees buckled, and she grabbed the back of the armchair to keep from hitting the floor. 50 million, she screamed, her face twisting into a grotesque mask of greed and loss. "You are lying. That is our money. Grandma left that to all of us. You can't take it." She lunged toward me, her hands clawing at the air, but James stepped in front of me, a silent wall of muscle. Bianca stopped, panting, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. "I was going to be rich," she wailed, turning to Verna. "Mom, do something. She stole $50 million from us. That is my money. That is my Aspen house. That is my life." I watched her melt down with cold detachment. It was never your money, Bianca, I said softly. Grandma left the land to the person who would care for it, and since you and Verna were planning to turn it into a garbage dump for a quick payout, you forfeited your moral claim long ago. As for the legal claim, since I bought the tax liens on the property 2 years ago, when Verna stopped paying them, the title has been in my name for 18 months. The quitclaim deed Greg tried to make me sign was just a test you all failed. Verna, who had been silent until now, suddenly let out a gasp. She pressed her hand to her chest, her eyes rolling back in her head. It was a performance I had seen 1,000 times before. Whenever she lost control of a narrative, whenever she faced consequences, she became the victim. My heart. Verna moaned, clutching her pearl necklace. Oh God, my heart! I can't breathe! Nia, you are killing me! She slumped sideways on the sofa, sliding dramatically until she was lying on the cushions, her breathing ragged and loud. Mom! Bianca screamed, dropping to her knees beside her. You killed her, Nia. Look what you did. You gave her a heart attack. Call 911. Someone help. The guests looked panicked. Mr. Sterling reached for his phone. Don't, I commanded, my voice cutting through the hysteria. I looked at Verna lying on the sofa. I saw the way her eyelids fluttered. I saw that her color was fine. She is not having a heart attack, I said, walking over to stand over them. She is having a reality check. I looked down at my mother. You can get up now, Verna. The ambulance isn't coming. And neither is the check for $50 million. Verna's eyes snapped open. The frailty vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. She sat up, pushing Bianca away. You are a monster, Verna spat, her voice steady and venomous. I should have left you at the hospital when you were born. There it is, I said, smiling. The mother I remember. I prefer this version. It is much more honest than the fainting act. Verna sat up on the sofa, smoothing her sweater with trembling hands, trying to regain some semblance of dignity after her failed performance. She looked around at the silent guests, and then glared at me with pure, unadulterated malice. She opened her mouth to speak, probably to demand that I leave her house immediately, but I held up a hand, stopping her before she could utter a word. You might want to save your breath, Verna, I said, my voice dropping to a register so low and serious that even the air conditioner seemed to pause. You are going to need it for packing. Verna narrowed her eyes, confusion warring with her anger. Packing, she repeated. What are you talking about? You are the one leaving Naya. Get out of my house before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing. This is my property. My husband and I paid for it with our blood and sweat. I walked over to the fireplace where a framed photo of the house sat proudly on the mantel. I picked it up, looking at the picture of the manicured lawn and the fresh paint job. Actually, that is not entirely true, I said, turning to face her. The house was paid off, yes. Until about 18 months ago, that was when a second mortgage was taken out against the equity. A very large high-interest loan for $400,000. Verna stood up, her face flushing red. Liar, she spat. We have no mortgage. The deed is in the safe. Is it? I asked, tilting my head toward Bianca, who was now trying to inch her way toward the hallway, hoping to disappear. Why don't you check the safe, Verna? Or better yet, why don't you ask your golden child where the money went? Verna turned slowly to look at Bianca. Bianca froze. She looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a semi-truck. She shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her face again, but this time they were tears of genuine terror. Mom, she is lying, Bianca sobbed, but her voice lacked conviction. Do not listen to her. I reached into the leather folder James was holding and pulled out the final document of the night. It was a foreclosure notice stamped with urgent red letters. You see, Verna? I continued, relentless. Bianca developed a bit of a habit. Online gambling, crypto schemes that Greg promised were sure things. It turns out losing money is expensive. She forged your signature on the loan documents. She used her position as your favorite to access the safe, steal the deed, and leverage this house to fund her addiction. Verna let out a strangled sound, looking from me to Bianca. Bianca, tell me it isn't true, Verna whispered. Tell me you didn't gamble away my house. Bianca collapsed onto the floor, weeping into her hands. I thought I could win it back, she wailed. I was just on a losing streak, Mom. I was going to pay it off before you found out. I just needed a little more time. I stepped closer, dropping the foreclosure notice onto the coffee table. Time ran out last month, I said. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings 30 days ago. You ignored the letters because Bianca was intercepting the mail. The sheriff was scheduled to arrive on Monday to evict you. The guests gasped. Mr. Sterling looked at the floor, embarrassed to be witnessing the total disintegration of a family. But I continued, enjoying the way Verna's knees were starting to buckle. I have a relationship with that particular bank, as you know. When I saw the address on the distressed asset list this morning, I made a phone call. I bought the debt. I paused, letting the weight of the words settle over them like a shroud. I paid off the arrears. I paid off the principal. The bank transferred the title to my holding company an hour ago. I took a step back, surveying the room that I had been banished from 8 years ago. The room where I was told I wasn't good enough. The room where I was made to sleep on the floor. So currently, I said, my voice ringing with finality, I am the sole owner of this property, and I have a very strict policy regarding tenants. I do not harbor criminals, I do not harbor liars, and I certainly do not harbor people who treat me like garbage. I looked at my watch, the Patek Philippe glinting under the chandelier lights. It is now 9 o'clock. You have exactly 30 minutes to gather your personal effects and vacate the premises. Whatever is left inside at 9:30 becomes the property of Ethelgard Systems and will be donated to charity. Verna screamed. It was a primal sound of loss and rage. You can't do this, she screeched, lunging toward me. This is my home. You can't throw your own mother out on the street on Christmas. I didn't flinch. James stepped forward, blocking her path with a stern look. You threw me out on Christmas Eve, Verna, I reminded her, cold as ice. You threw me out because I wouldn't marry for money. Now you are leaving because you have none. It seems poetic, don't you think? I turned to the guests who were already grabbing their coats, desperate to escape the blast zone. Party is over, everyone, I announced. Please drive safely. Then I looked back at my family, broken and weeping amidst the ruins of their own making. Tick-tock, I whispered. 29 minutes left. My father gathered the last shreds of his crumbling dignity and pointed a shaking finger at the front door, telling me to get out of his house immediately because he would not tolerate such disrespect under his roof any longer. I watched him posture, trying to look like the patriarch he had failed to be, and I felt a cold smile tugging at the corners of my mouth because he had just walked right into the final trap I had set. I asked him quietly if he was absolutely sure it was still his roof, because according to the county clerk and the bank, he had not legally owned this house for quite some time. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating as I reached into my bag one last time and pulled out a thick envelope that landed on the coffee table with a thud that echoed like a gavel striking a block. Bianca went pale instantly, her eyes darting between me and the envelope like a trapped animal, because she knew exactly what was inside and she knew her time was finally up. I watched my mother pick up the documents, her hands trembling so hard, the papers rattled as she tried to read the foreclosure notice that had been sent to this address 3 months ago, a notice she never received because her precious golden child had intercepted the mail every single day. I explained slowly and clearly, so there would be no misunderstanding, that their beloved Bianca had developed quite a taste for high-stakes poker, and when her luck ran out, she did not stop playing, she just needed more collateral. She had forged their signatures on a second mortgage, and then a third, using the equity in the family home, the home my father had bragged about paying off years ago, to fund her nights at the casino. My mother gasped, dropping the papers as if they burned her skin, turning to look at her favorite daughter, with a horror I had never seen on her face before, asking if it was true. Bianca tried to stammer out an excuse blaming bad luck and predatory lenders, claiming she was going to fix it with one big win, but her stuttering only confirmed the truth that she had gambled away their security while they were busy criticizing my life choices. I pointed out the dates on the foreclosure warnings, showing them how close they had come to finding a sheriff's padlock on the front door without any warning. The bank had scheduled the auction for last month, and they would have been on the street with nothing but the clothes on their backs if someone had not stepped in to intervene. My father looked at me with a flicker of hope in his eyes, assuming that I had paid it off, out of the kindness of my heart, assuming that despite everything I was still the dutiful daughter who would save them from ruin. He started to say thank you, started to talk about how we could work this out as a family, but I cut him off with a laugh that had no humor in it. I told him he misunderstood the situation entirely, because I did not pay off the mortgage to save them. I bought the debt from the bank. I purchased the property at the pre-foreclosure price, using the capital from my company, because it was a prime piece of real estate, and I knew the value would appreciate once I renovated it. I walked over to the fireplace and ran my hand along the mantel, looking at the family photos that had never included me, and told them the harsh reality of their situation. Currently, I am the sole owner of this property, and I have the deed right here to prove it. I looked at my parents, who were huddled on the sofa looking small and defeated, and then at Bianca, who was weeping silently in the corner, realizing she had destroyed the one safety net she had left. I told them that I do not have a habit of letting parasites live in my investment properties rent-free. I checked my watch, making a show of looking at the time, and told them they had exactly 30 minutes to gather whatever personal belongings they could carry and vacate the premises. My mother started to wail, screaming that I could not do this to my own flesh and blood, that it was illegal to kick them out in the cold without notice. I calmly informed her that since the title transfer was completed weeks ago and they had no lease agreement, they were technically squatters on my property. I had already called the local police to ensure the eviction was peaceful, and they would be arriving shortly to escort anyone off the premises who refused to leave voluntarily. I walked to the front door and opened it wide, letting the cold air rush into the warm house, and told them the clock was ticking and every minute they wasted arguing was a minute they were not packing. As the reality finally crashed down on them and they scrambled to find suitcases, blaming each other and screaming in panic, I stood by the door, the unloved daughter who had become the landlord of their lives, watching the house that had been my prison finally become my trophy. My mother realized that her anger was getting her nowhere, so she switched tactics, instantly dissolving into a puddle of tears on the hardwood floor she no longer owned, reaching out to grab the hem of my pants like a beggar. She looked up at me with eyes swimming in tears and started wailing about the sacred bond between a mother and child, asking how I could be so cruel to the woman who gave me life. She talked about her sacrifices and how she had carried me for 9 months and how she had done everything to give me a good home, trying to rewrite history right there on the rug. She cried out that they were family and family does not do this to each other, begging me to remember the good times and pleading for just one more chance to make things right. I looked down at her not with pity, but with a sense of detached curiosity, wondering if she actually believed the lies falling from her trembling lips. I gently but firmly stepped back, removing myself from her grasp, creating a physical distance that finally matched the emotional chasm that had existed between us for years. I asked her quietly if she remembered Christmas Eve 8 years ago. She stopped crying for a second, blinking in confusion at the sudden change of subject, but I did not give her time to answer. I reminded her of the night I came home from college after switching my major from law to business against their wishes. That night, the temperature outside had dropped to -10 degrees, and the wind was howling against these very windows, rattling the panes with a ferocity that made everyone grateful to be inside. I described the memory that was branded into my mind, how she had not cared about the freezing cold or the holiday spirit when she opened the back door and threw my suitcase out into the deep snow. I reminded her how she had tossed my winter coat on top of the pile and told me that if I wanted to make my own decisions, I could pay for my own roof, because she would not harbor a disappointment under hers. I told her clearly so everyone, including the silent neighbors who might be listening, could hear that I spent that night shivering on a metal bench at the bus station because my own mother decided I was not worthy of shelter. I pulled out my phone and checked the weather app, turning the screen so she could see the numbers glowing brightly. Today it is 5 degrees above zero, which is quite a bit warmer than that terrible night. I looked her dead in the eye and told her that technically, I am being 15 degrees more merciful than she ever was to me. I am giving them 30 minutes in the daylight to gather their things, while she gave me 30 seconds in the dark to get out. Before she could come up with another excuse or manipulation, the room was suddenly illuminated by flashing red and blue lights washing over the pale faces of my family. 2 police officers stepped through the open door, but they were not looking for me. They walked straight past my mother and approached my father, who had been trying to blend into the shadows near the hallway. It turned out that my investigation into the house deed had uncovered more than just a second mortgage. In his desperation to cover Bianca's mounting gambling debts and maintain their facade of wealth, Greg had been falsifying financial records at his firm and countersigning fraudulent loan documents. The bank had flagged the activity, and the foreclosure was just the tip of the iceberg. As the officers read him his rights and clicked the handcuffs around his wrists, he did not look at his wife or his golden child with concern. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, screaming that I was a snake who had ruined this family as they dragged him out to the waiting squad car. His reputation, which he valued more than his children, was destroyed in front of the entire neighborhood in a matter of seconds. That left Verna and Bianca alone in the silent hallway with the clock ticking down the final seconds of their grace period. They did not have time to pack suitcases or carefully wrap their valuables or choose what sentimental items to keep. They frantically grabbed a roll of black trash bags from under the kitchen sink, the only luggage they now had. I watched as my sister, the former beauty queen who used to mock my clothes, looked disheveled and frantic, stuffing her designer dresses into a plastic garbage bag indiscriminately. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably, shoving shoes and coats into a sack, her hands shaking so hard she dropped half of what she tried to hold. When the 30 minutes were up, I did not have to say a word. I simply held the door open and watched them stumble down the driveway. Bianca was dragging a tearing garbage bag that spilled a silk scarf onto the dirty pavement, but she didn't stop to pick it up. My mother was clutching a framed photo of herself, looking back at the house with a look of utter despair. They stood on the curb shivering as the reality set in, while the neighbors peered through their curtains, witnessing the fall of the high and mighty family. I stood in the warm entryway, wrapping my coat tighter around myself, not feeling joy, but a profound sense of balance being restored. The wind picked up, blowing their hair across their faces, but I did not invite them back in. I simply closed the heavy oak door, turning the lock with a loud, satisfying click, leaving them to face the winter they had created for themselves. I walked out of the heavy oak door for the last time, leaving the keys on the hook, because I had no intention of living in a museum of bad memories. My driver was waiting at the curb, standing next to the open door of my black Rolls-Royce, which gleamed under the streetlights like a dark jewel. I slid into the leather interior, which smelled of rich cedar and freedom. My assistant was already waiting inside, holding a chilled bottle of vintage champagne and 2 crystal flutes. We did not say a word as the cork popped with a soft sigh. The sound marked the definitive end of a chapter that had dragged on for far too long. As I took the first sip of the crisp golden liquid, I pulled out my phone to make the most important call of the evening. I dialed the number of the regional director for the Children's Education Fund, a woman I had been in talks with for months regarding my asset portfolio. When she answered, her voice was warm and professional, completely unlike the screeching demands I had just left behind. I told her that I had made my final decision regarding the $50 million commercial plot of land that my family had been so desperate to get their hands on. I told her I was donating the entire deed to the foundation, effective immediately, to build a specialized school and housing center for underprivileged children. I made it explicitly clear that the transfer was to happen first thing in the morning, ensuring that not a single penny of that asset's value would ever find its way back to the people who had tormented me. I could practically hear her smiling through the phone as she thanked me profusely, But I told her no thanks were necessary. There was a poetic justice in knowing that the fortune my parents and sister had lied, cheated, and stolen to obtain would now go to children who actually deserved a chance at a better life. I hung up the phone feeling lighter than I had in decades. The driver put the car in gear, and we began to pull away from the curb. I glanced out the tinted window one last time, not because I missed them, but because I needed to see the truth. Under the harsh yellow glow of the street lamp, Verna and Bianca were not comforting each other in their time of loss. They were at each other's throats. I watched my mother pointing an accusing finger at her golden child, screaming while Bianca shoved her hand away, her face twisted in ugly rage, blaming Verna for not stopping me sooner. They were already tearing each other apart, consuming themselves in the vacuum I had left behind. I watched them for a fleeting second, realizing that they deserved each other in a way that I never deserved them. I turned my head away, facing forward toward the road ahead, where the city lights were twinkling like promised stars. I did not feel sad, and I did not feel guilty. I just felt free. The car accelerated smoothly, carrying me away from the wreckage of the past and into a future that was finally entirely my own. The most powerful lesson from my journey is that DNA does not grant anyone a license to abuse you. For years I waited for an apology that would never come, and validation that I did not actually need. True freedom began the moment I stopped trying to buy their love with my silence, and started investing in my own dignity. We often fear that cutting ties with toxic family members will leave us empty, but as I drove away that night, I realized that removing the people who drain your spirit is the only way to make room for those who will actually nourish it. If you have ever had to make the hard choice to walk away from people who were supposed to protect you, please share your story in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the face of betrayal.